Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is, I think, the penultimate session on Maps of Meaning. And Roger, Victor, and Claire have been doing a magnificent job. So I'm delighted to have them back. Roger, take it away.
Thank you, Shrikant. And first and foremost, I did get the count wrong. There is one more lecture beyond this one. I think last time I said that this would be the last one, but there's actually one more. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. Yes, perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us for Maps of Meaning 12. This lecture was called Truth That Matters. And so to get started, I would like to go over some general tools and goals for this presentation. The toolbox, in other words, the things that you should be bringing from previous lectures or should at least be familiar with, the Genesis myth, specifically the idea of humans realizing their vulnerability, and that idea that at some point in our evolutionary history, we became conscious enough to be self-aware of the fact of our mortality and our limitations. The second concept is the divine child or the hero myth and how that functions along with known and unknown territory. Additionally, from last presentation is the totalitarian loop and how you can fall into this loop that kind of self-justifies and self-references itself, along with the idea of nihilism. And here, the idea of nihilism being set up as Peterson talks about inability to actually create or maintain a value structure or a belief structure. As far as goals, we're going to have only 3 for this one. Understanding the basic idea behind the hero myth, understanding the risk of in acting out the hero myth, and also understanding Peterson's perspective at the end. And for this takeaway, I'll actually be giving a couple of questions that I would ask people to consider. They're going to be the same questions that Peterson asks us all to consider at the end of the lecture. But I think this would be some good questions to spark some discussion. And a quick introduction as to what it is we'll be talking about today and what Peterson covers in the lecture. He's essentially, as I mentioned earlier, covers the idea of the hero myth, the advantages of taking that behavior profile on, the dangers of anomalies, especially really big or world-changing anomaly, the Christian solution to world-changing anomaly, and then finally Peterson's alternative. But to start us off with some stories about some heroes, Victor's gonna jump in and give us an introduction to a couple hero myths.
Thanks, Roger. So tonight, let's look at a hero myth called King Arthur. Some of us are aware of it. So this is a myth came out of British and English imperial era. And the idea of this myth is the King Arthur, he is a mythological figure, and he's a king of a kingdom, Camelot. At the same time, he is also the head of all the knights in the kingdom. And you can see in the picture, there are knights and king, and the table, it's a round table. So going into a little bit of the details. So here we have a king and we have knights, and he has his own power in a hierarchical way. But when it comes to some other things, they sit down at the table and they discuss. And the round table actually represents the equality of the power or the equality of that person. And in this mythical story, there is a particular story element that goes with it. It's the idea of Holy Grail. The idea of Holy Grail is something that is elusive, that has been lost. The Holy Grail, it needs to be found, and it has some mythical redemptive powers. So sometimes it is represented as a cup or a dish or a stone, and it has been lost. And the idea of knights is to go out and find this Holy Grail. But where to find it? So they can go out and they don't know where to look way to look at. And the idea behind it is to go out and find the darkest place and look for it. So that's the idea behind going into this particular adventure. So in one regard, we can say that if we have like 10 nights and they're going in 10 different ways, and they will find their own particular dark place and they will go find it. So in that regard, they're going to different places. Objectively, we can say they are going to different places, but psychologically, they are going to the same place because it's the darkest place. It's the place that if we ask the question ourselves, that is something that we do not want to go, that we want to avoid. That is something that's strange, that's unknown, that we do not want to go. So in that regard, they are going to the same place. And Peterson says a similar kind of story structure we can see in Polish literature, Heart of Darkness. This came out in late 19th century from Joseph Conrad. And incidentally, I just found out that particular work has been the inspiration for Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now movie. And you can see how the story goes in, the hero goes in, the protagonist goes in and goes to the strangest place, the darkest place, even though the protagonist is not that confident going in. So Peterson here actually gives a real life example that he himself experienced. It's a story of a 4-year-old kid's dream. So this is Peterson's nephew, who was 4 years old around that time. And this kid, he was having some trouble. So he was having trouble sleeping, and he's waking up in the night and he was having dreams and nightmares, and he wakes up and he screams, and this has been going on for like 4 to 6 months, Peterson says. And to give a little background about this one, so the kid is 4 years old, and in his own life, he's going to a new place. He's going to kindergarten, he's meeting new people, new kids, and he's in a way stepping out of his comfort zone. And at the same time, his parents are going through a divorce. So that is some going on in his life. And at the same time, Peterson mentions he also knows, so he watched a few Disney movies and a few stories, and he knows what a knight means. And he runs around the house with a knife kind of thing, and with a sword, and with a shield, and acting as if he is a knight. So one day, Peterson was at their house, and obviously the kid was having nightmares. He wakes up in the night and goes through the whole thing of, and his parents are not happy about it. So in the morning, they sit around the breakfast table, and then Peterson asks the kid, did you have a good sleep? And kid, what is it now? He says, yes. And then Peterson asks, did you have any dream last night? He says, yes, I did have a dream. And Peterson says, can you expand? And do you want to say what the dream is about? So the kid says, so I was just playing around, and then this particular monster-like thing comes. So this monster-like thing comes, and it has hair all over its body, and it has a beak-like thing, and it is coming at me, and it is poking me. And it's not just one beak-like dwarf thing, but it's many of those things, and they are coming at me, and they are poking at me. They are trying to bite me with their beaks. And Peterson says, okay, so there's anything more? And the kid goes on to say, it's not just these monsters, these dwarf monsters, but there is another dragon that is spitting out these dwarf monsters, and it is just spitting out these new things. So I don't have any way to get out of it. Well, now we can understand why the kid is having such a bad time falling asleep. So now Peterson asks, all right, so now you have these little dwarfs coming at you, and there is this dragon that is spitting out all these dwarfs, and they are coming to bite you. Do you have any, what do you want to do now? How can you solve this problem? And the kid thinks for a little bit and he says, I will grab my shield and my sword, and I'll take my dad and I'll go and jump on the dragon and pop its eyes. And now that the dragon cannot see me, I'll go into the dragon and find a place where these monsters are coming out, and I will chop it out and I'll finish the problem. So that's the kid's solution. So the kid himself came out with the solution. So now the dragon is gone, the monsters are gone. So after this, the kid did not have any nightmares. And Peterson says he spoke to his mother and no nightmares at all. So that's his experience about the whole thing. Also, going into psychotherapy, he also mentions as they do a similar kind of thing with the patients that come into their, they come and consult them. The idea is, so a person comes in with some kind of anxiety or depression, and they are in a way stunted in their life. They have stopped moving forward and they feel this anxiety and they come in. And then therapist says, okay, so you have some problems in your life. They seem like they are huge problems. So let's take each problem and break them into digestible pieces. And then now that you have digestible pieces, the things that you can handle by yourself, those little things, and then hit one by one and go forward. And that's the idea. And usually what Peterson says is the people who come to get help from psychotherapy, especially with anxiety and depression, who are suffering from that. So essentially they have the problem of facing the problem that is existing in their life. So then the therapist goes in and says, take a little bit of action, break it down, and face it and learn something from it. That's how you get to be victorious. And most importantly, it's not the idea of solving a particular problem, but it is to develop this identity that you are a kind of person who will stand right at the problem, at the cusp of the problem, at the threshold, and you stand at the threshold of what you know and what you don't know, and you face it and then learn something from it. So that's the idea. It's the idea of that person going into their own darkness and facing it so that they will come out victorious. And there is this amazing quote from alchemy literature. It's called, it goes like this: Instaculinus inventur. And so in Latin, and it's translated into, in filth, it will be found. What you need most will always be found where you least wish to look. And you can see this quote being referred by Carl Jung many times in his work. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. So essentially gonna hash out similarly to what Victor was talking about. We're gonna go over in some details the two stories first, right? So we have the Holy Grail and a couple of things about the Holy Grail that are interesting. The first is that the Grail itself is held as a holy item, an item that has oftentimes either held the blood of Christ or was used at the Last Supper, which sometimes is also both, because Jesus turns turns wine into his own blood, and that is the Eucharist. Then there's also the idea that that item can be redeemed, as Victor had mentioned, and that it's been lost. And this is kind of a motif that Peterson points out using Jung's thinking, that the reason alchemy exists is because, according to the canonical Christian worldview, the world had already been redeemed by the death of Jesus, but it seemed like the redemption was only metaphorical, and the material world was still trying to figure out a way to redeem itself, because it still had the original sin problem of us realizing we're all going to die and we're all very limited in space and time. And that still seems to be a big problem for anyone who's still in the material world and cares about what's happening there. And that alchemy was this idea that if we study God's world, we could eventually find something that would allow us to restore paradise on earth. And that's this idea of the Holy Grail. But there's also a couple of other interesting dynamics, especially with the knights. It's the idea that the knights are seeking to redeem the world. So in other words, the protagonist, or the ideal personality, or the ideal person, is the person who is attempting to redeem the world. More importantly, that because they all sit around in a round table, they are all equal, even though among them there's a king. So there's this connotation that, like, look, that normally under normal circumstances, yes, there's a hierarchy. It's like, but what we're after is so big that it doesn't matter if it's a king or a serf who's chasing it, right? It's like, it's irrelevant to the degree of what we're actually seeking here. And it's also a quest that's worth having, not just for these knights, but even for the king himself to go out there and looking for it. It's something that's of utmost value. And the starting motif that reflects what Victor was just ending on with that quote of Carl Jung, which I actually also have. But it's the idea that as the knights start their journey, they look and try to find, they walk around the castle looking at the forest, and they start their journey not looking for a specific location or even knowing where to look, but rather, similar to what we've been talking about, it's a psychological event. It's the fact that they pick the part of the forest that looks darkest to them, and that's where they enter. And this is the true heart of darkness, the place that is most unknown to that person and therefore the most terrifying. And if you see the correlation between that story and Peterson's nephew, which is why Peterson's kind of talking about both, he points out that in this story of, he's essentially being chased by a bunch of beaked, hairy dwarves that are constantly trying to bite him. There's this dragon in the back, and doesn't matter how many dwarves the nephew kills, the dragon just puffs up more. And there's just this constant wave. And Peterson points out that that's essentially a Hydra myth. And the Hydra myth essentially just represents what life is like. Any solution you create is going to cause more problems. Now, it may not be the same problems, but no matter what you do, there will always be more problems that arise from your actions, right? There's always going to be an effect or an unintended effect. And it's kind of just a representation that you're never really done solving problems. You're just constantly moving on to the next one. And he's kind of stuck in this dilemma of like, well, it doesn't matter how many problems I solve, how many of these dwarves I kill, that thing back there is just going to keep throwing waves and waves at me. And Peterson asks a leading question here. And he's pointed out when he's told the story in other times that he says, what I asked him wouldn't be admissible in court because it was leading. Because when I asked, it's like, what could you do about that? It's important to note that in asking that, there's an implication that you could do something about it. And that's kind of, that little implication is what we're going to be talking about today, because I think it's at the core of what the hero myth actually is and what Peterson's really trying to point at. But as Victor covered, he gets his father, goes instead to the dragon rather than taking on the dwarves, pokes its eye out, and this is all the nephew's fantasy, goes down the throat of the dragon and goes to where the fire itself is coming out, like the thing inside the dragon that creates the fire, cuts out a piece of that, and then takes that and uses it as a shield. And his nephew essentially has learned the same thing that was being communicated in the myth of the Knights of the Round Table. In the same way, the knights sought answers in parts of the forest that were darkest to them. Peterson's nephew realized that the solution to his mythical problem lied in the place where he least wanted to look. Though the child's solution to dream is deeper than, in many ways, as Peterson explains. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into what that solution actually entails. So the first question is, well, why is this solution archetypal? In other words, why is the solution that the little boy uses to solve a problem in his dreams a problem that we constantly see represented in a lot of stories? Well, there's a couple of archetypal themes. One is the dragon, which is and always has been a very classic representation of chaos. And it's also the source of dwarves, which is essentially the source of threats, the source of problems, the source of novelty. This is the negative side of chaos. And it's essentially also a symbol of everything we can't look away from. If you remember when we first started talking about symbols and the amalgamations of threats and the idea of a dragon being or Kali, for example, all the things that are dangerous. So the dragon being reptilian, while also a tiger, while also something that can fly, while also something that can burn you, while also something that can eat you. It's all the things that you don't want to happen to you. So you have that thing, which is essentially a representation of scary, right? And all like a amalgamation of that. And then you consider the idea of the heart of darkness, this idea of like, where would you least want to look? And you can think that within this context of this dream, it's easy to conclude that the heart of darkness, the place you least want to be, is also the dragon. So according to the dream, these new dwarves come out every time the dragon breathes out smoke. So the source of the problem is also the place that is most terrifying and is also the place that holds the solution. All that is held within that dream, in that context. So then what happens why do the dreams go away once the child comes up with a hypothetical while he's awake of how he could solve that problem? Well, for Peterson's point is that you essentially learn two things. He learns two things. The first is that if you keep having problems that scare you, you should seek out the source of your anxieties and explore them in detail until you find information that will protect you against it. In other words, being able to actually explore the very things that scare you is the best solution to get over the things that scare you. The second thing that he learns is, and this is much more internal and much more to that question that Peterson asked him, is that he learns that when you succeed, you learn that you are the thing that can confront the dragon of chaos and win. And to understand what that means is essentially, and we'll get more into this, but it's essentially, as we mentioned earlier, understanding your story. This change is understanding who you are as a character within that story, right? You may have a conceptualization of you as a weak character, as someone who has to run, as someone who's vulnerable. And what happens when you confront that and succeed, when you confront your fear and succeed, your conceptualization of who you are within your own story is changed. So this is quoting Peterson. If your frame of reference gets blown away by something you don't understand, some new challenge, and you face the challenge, at least courageously and humbly, which means that you don't run away because you still have something to learn, then you can extract something out of that battle that enables you to withstand it. What's interesting about this mythological story from just a mythic perspective, this is the exact same philosophy that we teach, or that's taught in therapy whenever someone goes to therapy. But before we jump into that idea that's employed in therapy, it's worth noting Peterson's conceptualization of anxiety. There are many theories of how fear works, and I do want to highlight two because there's one that's very common and Peterson has one that's quite the opposite of that. So one theory of fear is habituation. And in this model, the idea is that you're exposed to something and you can either be taught a fear or you just habituate to a fear. So in other words, when you do, for example, exposure therapy, which we'll talk in a little bit about, what's actually happening is you are afraid of spiders. At some point you were taught that you were afraid of spiders, but if you're exposed to spiders long enough, you start to get bored and the fear response just kind of dies out. Peterson does not like this point of view at all. He doesn't think that that accounts for how fear works. For one thing, he says there's certain things that you should fear and that you can't easily be habituated to. But more importantly, for him, it's the inverse. You don't learn how to be afraid. That's actually your default. Your default is fear and terror. What you learn to be is courageous. You learn how to adapt and to overcome extremely taxing challenges. In Peterson's view, the change that occurs isn't one that's externalized. In other words, you don't see the world as, oh, spiders actually aren't that scary. It's the exact opposite. You understand, oh, I'm not the kind of thing that needs to be scared of spiders, right? It's a change in self-conception rather than a change in the world exterior. And you learn that you're not the person that has to run away. You can learn that you're the person that can stand there while you're anxious and actually learn something. And you learn that you're the person that can rise to do that you can rise to be that person. And once you learn that anxiety can be withstood, that fear isn't going to kill you, it's just fear, it's just a sensation, that then anxiety kind of loses its bite. You won't die to anxiety. And if you can bear it, you can learn something from the very thing that scares you, which also makes it much less scary. It's the idea of like, as you expose yourself to the thing that terrifies you, you learn how to not be scared by it. And a good example is exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm currently giving a talk, but in high school, I was a complete recluse. I couldn't talk. I struggled really, really hard. And it was only because I chose to apply to a bartending job, which was terrifying to me, but it was something I wanted to do. And there were so many situations where it was awkward and scary, but being able to stay there, I was able to actually learn a lot of things. And what I learned wasn't, oh, this is how you talk. What I learned was like, oh, I always assumed people didn't care what I had to say. I always assumed I wasn't the kind of person that should be listened to. And what I'm learning is like, no, if I actually talk and just speak my mind, people are interested in what I actually have to say. And this idea of truly confronting and changing how you see yourself is something that Peterson points out that Edna Foa, who is this lady right here, and her work with PTSD. And she has a very counterintuitive approach. And her approach works especially for victims of violent rape who suffer from PTSD. And the approach is that you relive the trauma over and over again in as much detail as possible, including, and this is the most difficult part, the emotional and motivational aspects of the attack. Obviously, this is extremely difficult, and for good reason, right? Like the trauma itself is terrible. The victim was obviously hurt and does not, for good reason, want to revisit it, and it scares and disgusts them. But what is actually found is that if this approach is implemented, you will get better faster and you'll stay better longer. And it's this idea of the very thing that you're terrified of, the very idea and understanding of that is what's making it so hard for you to actually understand and fully comprehend that situation, is because of that fear. And Peterson points out that this is actually very similar also in exposure therapy. Peterson points out that bravery generalizes. His example he often uses is that an example that he uses is that sometimes you can help. He helped a woman get over her phobia. I don't think he ever said what phobia was, but that he helps her get over a phobia. And then right after that, she goes home and gets into a huge fight with her husband and finally stands up to him, right? And the idea is she didn't do that because she was able to get over a phobia. She did that because she changed her conceptualization of who she was. Once she was able to overcome her phobia, she realized, oh, I'm not the kind of person that needs to even be worried about that. And then that generalizes to a lot of other things that she might also be scared of. So it's an important concept to understand, but also Peterson asks us to consider what this idea would look like in its extreme form. In other words, truly being able to go to the darkest places of yourself and others and really look at the parts of you that you might not want to look. Because he asks us, imagine if your whole life you never turned away from a mistake, not even once. So that whenever you made a mistake that you could rectify, you did rectify. Then the question would be, what exactly would you be like? Would you be suffering from all this existential trouble? Would you be vulnerable to anxiety? What would you be like? And then I think I only know a couple of stories like that. And the one that I told you is the story of Solzhenitsyn. And that's the person we'll be looking at next. Because for Peterson, Solzhenitsyn is a very, very interesting and important case in history. Because real quick recap for anyone who doesn't know, Solzhenitsyn, he's incarcerated in the Soviet Union in the Gulag after his service as a soldier. And Peterson notes that while he's stuck in the Gulag, he has a very convenient narrative that he could easily buy into, right? It's one that requires next to no effort, and most of us would actually probably agree, is that the reason that he's locked up is not his fault at all. It's Stalin's fault and the authoritarian government that has put him in that Gulag. And what Peterson points out is like, yeah, reasonable story to tell yourself, reasonable way to interpret reality. Though the story works, it kind of leaves you with no responsibility on him. It also leaves him with nothing to do. And he has nothing but time. After all, he's in the Gulag. And Peterson says, well, there is an alternative. Let's pretend that the reason that things happen to me and that happens to me that I don't like or that I can't tolerate is not because I'm a victim of fate, but because there's something I didn't do. So he goes through his whole life with a fine-tooth comb and notices anytime I didn't do something right or let something go. And not because you're following, some religious code or some moral code that you were taught, but just because I noticed it. And what I mean by that is that sensation that we've talked about before, that consciousness, that your conscience that tells you, it's like, you shouldn't do that, or hey, you should do something. Both of which I think most of us have experienced. And what would happen if you just listened to that as though you had a debt to existence? So that's exactly what Solzhenitsyn claims he does. He spends the next 15 years kind of going through his life and really trying to address all his own personal sins that don't fit by his own idea of that. And what happens to that person in the process? Well, what he notes is, as a result, he really starts to admire people, specifically certain people that in every sense of the word were in hell, right? It's the Gulag. People are freezing to death. People are malnourished. They're starving. They're dying everywhere. And these people wouldn't break. These people would not break their own moral code, and that they would be able to display admirable qualities even when there was in a place where there wasn't any hope. And what he notices is, once I figured out that I was wrong, I could actually find the people that were doing that and then learn from them. Because in listening to that internal voice, it started to highlight other people that were doing similar things. So, you can look at it from a religious perspective too. And the religious perspective is that the correction of sin allows you to notice those who are also avoiding sin, which allows you to imitate and learn from others. Or you can take it a purely secular perspective, where it's just, as you seem to start to follow a more pro-social internal behavior, that is what starts to become admirable, not just among you, but among others. And that's what starts to become highlighted. That's what starts to gain valence within your hierarchy of value. And then after that, he writes the Gulag Archipelago. And this book is one of the main contributions to the fall of the USSR. And it's been held as, it's kind of what highlights all the horrors of the USSR, or at least one of the factors that does it. And it's really easy being on the other end of it, being like, well, yeah, but come on, it was Solzhenitsyn. Whereas from Peterson's perspective, it's like, no, it was just some random guy in jail. And all he really did was, who truly questioned if he had something to do with his own condition, and that he took full responsibility for his own condition. And that him and other people that have tried like that seem to come up with a similar idea. And it's this idea of one person who stops lying can bring down a tyranny. And Peterson throws this in, and I think this is because Peterson tends to actually believe this in a literal sense. But he says, look, you don't have to believe in a literal sense. You can believe it just in a metaphorical sense, because you're also the victim of a tyranny as well as anyone else, your own tyranny. As we talked about earlier, you have that authoritarian loop. We all fall into it, and it's a very easy thing to fall into, of believing yourself and not wanting new information to invalidate your perspective. But if you stopped avoiding anomalies, specifically here, lying as a sin of omission, maybe you and even others may not be the victim of tyranny. So this is kind of the idea that Peterson's bringing out about, one, why you should tell the truth, or at least not lie, but then also two, this personality that can arise if you start to follow that internal, valence that you have of being aware of when you're doing something you yourself don't agree with, or being aware of when you're violating your own perspective. However, there's a big problem here. And the problem is, if you're going to be the hero that goes around and does confront all the anomalies and does take it full on, not all anomalies are built the same. Some are pretty big and really, really bad. And there's a big danger associated with this. So Peterson asks us, what's the worst parts of life, right? What's the parts of life that are just so difficult to even process? And he uses the idea of the brothers Karamazov with children suffering. That tends to be a pretty bad one. Or the fact that good people sometimes get sick and die, and sometimes painfully, completely unearned, right? Like they just suffer for no reason, it seems. Or the fact that there's tyrants all over the place and that torture people for no reason, or even worse, because they like doing it. The truth is, exploring anomalies can be so difficult that examining them can instead collapse your map. And this is what we were talking about with losing your religion, the previous lecture. This idea of a full collapse of the map and a full collapse of all value systems. And that's actually why I included this picture, because this was something that did it for me. And for anyone who wants to really understand what this picture even signifies, it's difficult to, but essentially it's in Cambodia, it's in a killing field, and it's the Khmer Rouge's, it's next to a mass grave that was used, that when it was exhumed, they didn't find anyone above the age of 2. So several hundred bodies, and that tree was used to essentially bash the skulls of children, right? Something like that. How do you make sense of that within your understanding of humanity, your understanding of morals, your understanding of the world? And Peterson's point is that there are certain things that are so dangerous to see, to look at, to try to comprehend, to wrap your head around, that they pose a massive threat to you. You can even see this in Set versus Osiris. The reason Osiris loses an eye, the reason taking on the evil side is quite damaging to even the person who's the hero in the story, is because there's a corruptive element to that. And as Peterson points out, so there's that collapse of the map, but then there's an even dangerous thing that happens, that after you've blown out 2 or 3 of those maps, or 2 or 3 of those frames of references, you start to develop a skepticism. As Peterson points out, he's like, he used to be a socialist, and then he becomes a Christian, and then he becomes New Age, but none of them seem to work. Well, then the conclusion can start to become, instead of being like, oh, socialism was wrong, Catholicism was wrong, New Age was wrong, is no, frames of references are wrong. No matter what way I think about it, there's no way to actually conceptualize this reality correctly. And that's how you get into the Nietzschean idea of the death of God, that there is no frame of reference that works. And that's where you get into the bigger problem of, but without a frame of reference, life is chaos. And if chaos is intolerable, therefore life is intolerable. And Peterson points out here that this is exactly why people protect their ideologies. This is why we're willing to go to war, and not just war, but mutually assured destructive war that will get us all killed, because we'd rather risk dying in some terrible abstract way than to lose our reference to all our values in our existence. And then the whole problem with that is you start to also create a good narrative for why evil not just should exist, but is fully justified, right? Peterson points out that you may start to get this constant loss of faith, this constant collapse of your map of what's important, what matters, what even means anything. And you start to adapt a very cynical perspective of, I'm not to be trusted. You're not to be trusted. Society's not to be trusted. And the structure of the whole world is not to be trusted. Therefore, the moral obligation is to work against it. Another way you can conceptualize this is, as we've talked about the 4 different factors, the Great Mother, the Great Father, the Dragon of Chaos, and the Divine Son, only the negative parts are true, right? If you only see the negative parts as true, then you end up in a place where life is just evil, life is just terrible, and there's nothing redeeming about it. So these are heavy-hitting anomalies. These are anomalies that will blow out your entire belief system. And Peterson points to another anomaly that's very similar, which is the one in Genesis, right? Going from unconscious, we're not aware that we even die, to fully realizing what exactly our existence means. And here he uses this image to make a couple quick points. And I'm sure we're all tired of talking about Genesis, so I'll make this quick. But essentially within here, you have in the middle, the snake, which is both the symbol of threat and Satan, but also the symbol of transformation. You have the tree. Within the tree, you have the fruit and also hosts. So the things that are given during communion for the Catholic religion. And you also have Eve giving the fruit of the tree of knowledge, but she's also giving death if you look closely, and there's skeletons. So you can see the division between the right and the left. On the right, you have the original sin, right? Where we all kind of messed up, and you can tell from Adam's face that he's not very proud of that. But it's the deliverance and the understanding that of our mortality. And on the left is the solution, is the salvation to that. It's what the church is attempting to provide as a solution for the terrible problem of the original sin. And on that one, you have the Virgin Mary. She's giving out hosts. They're the bread and wine, essentially. And it's the idea that in the Last Supper, Jesus essentially turns to his disciples and says, "You must consume me, my body and my blood." And as we've talked about before, there's this big connection between food, ideas, and transformation. And the idea, what does it mean to incorporate someone? What does it mean to take a piece of someone and ingest them and make that a part of you, let that become a part of you? And essentially what this image is representing is the problem and its solution, that you have a problem of death, and the solution is whatever it is that this symbol represents as a whole. And in some way, it's the incarnation of Christ, that in order to maintain redemption, it's necessary to embody the hero. But if we take a look at what that symbol actually means, you have the Christian perspective, which is essentially that you have to put your faith in Christ. You have to put your faith in the hero of that myth, right? And not only that, but you must also become that person. That's the idea of like, what would Jesus do, right? Embodying the personality, or at least the behavior profile of Jesus Christ, is one of the ways through salvation. It's not Peterson points out, it's not a great solution, mostly because it excludes a lot of people. It also requires that you buy into a really big framework. So Peterson gives a more up-to-date proposal, because he kind of points out, it's like, look, that was one of our attempts to try to understand it. And he says, and this is quoting Peterson, "I think we're actually sophisticated enough now, intellectually, psychologically, to actually start to understand what some of these stories mean. And since we have reasonably well-developed brains, we might as well use them. It'd be better if they were on our side, so to speak, than constantly conspiring to undermine our fate." And so what is that Peterson actually proposes? Well, he says, look, we're extremely, extremely, extremely complex. We're more complex than we can even understand how complex we are. Our nervous systems, and there was a small correction here, but our nervous systems have more possible connections than there are subatomic particles in the universe. And keyword there, possible. I think he misspeaks and doesn't say that, but it's possible connections. And so that means that we are so complex that we can't even comprehend how complex we actually are. We're actually more complex than anything else in the universe as a whole. That doesn't mean we're bigger or anything else, just the amount of variance within every single human being is massive to a point where we can't even account for. And not only that, but we're also just so complex that we don't even know at what level of analysis we should even see ourselves. In the West, we've settled on this idea that it's the individual, but that doesn't fully pan out completely. Peterson points out, it's like, you're a part of a family, and you would likely die for at least some of your family. And even if you didn't, you would also likely, if there was a war, be a part of your social group or your cultural group. And then he also brings up the ideas like, but also if we mess up the earth and we all die because of it, it turns out we're actually also a part of a biosphere. We're part of a lot more than what we normally see ourselves as. So we seem to have a lot of ways to even conceptualize ourselves, but no way to know which one's the correct one. And then Peterson goes, and if you go the other direction, instead of getting bigger and bigger, you go smaller and smaller, you run into a very big problem, which is past your phenomenological self, which is the you that's currently experiencing everything that you're experiencing. There's the physiological structure under that. And then under that, there's the cellular structure. And then under that, the atomic structure. And you can go on both ways. So there's a complete blindness even to what we are. So we're more complex than anything, than everything. You not being aware of that fact doesn't mean that that's not the case. Your consciousness just isn't sophisticated enough to model what it is and who it is you are. So it's essentially, it's a very limited amount kind So this is what Peterson's teeing up as his final pitch. And it's the pitch that we've been kind of circling and hitting on quite a bit. And it's this idea that what would it be like if you actually tried to live according to your own ideals? So for takeaway, I would like everyone to at least consider these questions. The first is, how do things change? And if instead of the world being made of objects, it's made of your own experience? Since we know that the world's way too complex for us to even really claim that we understand much, you know, any theory of what reality or the world or what the hell this is right now is just that, a theory. It's something that we're guessing might be, and that we hope we might be. The second question is, how does that change the world if you think you have an ethical relationship with that experience as a primary fact, not some secondary derivative? If we evolved first and foremost to act in the world, and we evolved a mechanism that tells us how to act in the world, that ethical relationship, and ethical for Peterson is action, because for him, any action is an ethical choice, right? Like you choose, when you have to choose between multiple options, whatever is defining your choice is what's defining your ethic. So considering that as a primary fact, and more importantly, as that relationship being something that you can actually sense, and how and what if the ethical relationship is so primary that you can't even look at the world except through an ethical lens? In other words, if you didn't have an ethics, you wouldn't be able to act, right? The fact that you're acting is a presumption that one thing is better than the other and is therefore a value call. And then finally, and the more heaviest one, how would this idea change how you conceptualize the world? And with that, I'll leave it be.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks. So that's a lot of questions, Roger. I don't know if people can discuss it in 20 minutes. Do you want to give a preference if you want to pick like maybe 2 questions or something like that?
Yeah, or I would just say what people think of this idea of our essentially that voice inside your head, or that notation, or that sensation that you have when it's like, oh, I shouldn't do this, or oh, I should do this. Like, I know I need to be doing this. That sensation as not just being dismissed as something not important, but as one of the most important indications of how we're supposed to live. It's essentially the key there.
Excellent. All right, folks, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. They will last for 20 minutes, and then we'll come automatically back in this room to continue the discussions. We'll get to talk about our takeaways and ask questions. Starting the breakout rooms now. We are all excited about the new book coming out on March 2nd. So it's going to be Dave followed by Pagor. Dave, what's your takeaway? And
Roger and Victor, another great presentation. Just an observation or a thought of mine, going after the dragon and going to find the Holy Grail are all external. And it just seemed to me that a lot of the most important battles I fight are internal, that people need to get themselves straightened out, to discover who they are, to improve their self-image. Any thought about that?
Go ahead. You guys can respond as and when with each takeaway or questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dave. Well, I mean, great point. I think a lot of I mean, that's kind of the whole idea of myths as phenomenological representations. It's the idea of the internal being represented externally. So you can also kind of see it as it's still an internal battle for the knights to enter the place that's darkest to them, because though there may not actually be any external threat, it's more the fact that that for them that is the darkest part, that is the scariest part. That's the actual challenge, and that's the actual overcoming of it. That's why everyone may see chaos in different things, but it's you have to encounter your chaos, not someone else's. So there's an internal aspect of yourself, in the same way as me and you may not have the same things in our Jungian shadow, but if you looked at the things that I have in my Jungian shadow, they may not be very they may be something that for you're like, yeah, I dealt with that a long time ago, but that's the more the internal aspect of it. You're muted, Shrikant.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Next up is Pegor, followed by Deepak. Pegor.
Hello, thank you, Roger, Claire, and Victor for tonight and every night past and future. My takeaway is a bit off, but I just wanted to say that whenever I don't listen to the voice in my head, I tend to regret it. So that thing is real. The takeaway that I got, and it's sort of my breakout room sort of helped me pull it out of me, is that the reason why I think like speech and the freedom of speech is so important, and why I think Peterson advocates for it, is that you can have the world strip away even your movement, like your physical movement, but they can't force you to say something you don't want to say. And so it's like speech is your final form of agency, like regardless of whether you like technically there's free will or not, like the final form of agency that someone has is their speech, and if you lose that, you lose everything. So not much of a question, but yeah.
Excellent. Roger, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's a great takeaway. Peterson sees it as essentially the only mechanism that can give birth to new ideas, and the mechanism that only mechanism that can correct bad ideas, right? If you can't offend and say what you think, even if it's not going to fit into some norm, it's the ability to actually do that. And that's the idea of like one person telling the truth can dismantle a tyranny, is because you break out of that totalitarian loop, right? By putting in an anomalous factor that can blow up that map.
I just want to add that if speech can do that, writing can do that even more, because it has a much more profound impact on you yourself and others. Yes, exactly. It's the same principle, externalizing the internal. So it's kind of like connected to Dave's observation. So all these external things are just ways of looking at internal things. So speech is a way of taking internal and making it external. Next up is going to be Deepak, followed by Maritza. Deepak, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was sharing with our group how the modern demons don't necessarily have to look like dinosaurs. It can be something under a microscope, like the corona or other kinds of pathologies. They're not necessarily scary when as it's embedded in our like instincts, because our survival instincts kind of makes us repulsive towards snakes and lizards and insects and other mammals, but maybe not. You're not gonna get scared if you see a corona on a medical textbook. But essentially, that is the kind of demons or dragons we're essentially fighting right now. And given how the story of his young nephew talking about fighting dwarfs coming out of a dragon's mouth kind of is very relevant, because corona things like diseases or microbes, they're like the ultimate dwarfs that you need to put out with fire or other kinds of tools, like maybe washing your hands or an autoclave, or maybe the UVC, put some light onto it. So you say, let there be light, because you could probably catch it up when you eat some bad apples, like bad bits of information. It doesn't have to be something that has to be consumed. It could be fake news in the internet, because that's also information, or maybe some kind of like uh, fecal transplant as well, like to the brain. So that may or may not work depending on whether it's suitable to your gut. So that's what is and in the end, like the Holy Grail is supposed to be for happiness and immortality. So you want to have a good time, long time, right? So kind of like suits in well into the clinical practice. Yeah, that's about it.
Right. Roger, you want to say something? Oh, I just assumed that you are unmuted, so you're saying
Oh,
something.
no, yeah, yeah, that's a great takeaway. I think it fits pretty well that to conceptualize the dragon and the dwarf, like the dwarves as corona for like the dragon just constantly spitting more. So
Okay, thank you, Maritza.
For this chapter here, this video, this week's topic, what comes to mind for me is that there's also the concept that the dragon could be yourself. You could be the dragon, and because you have to fight yourself in order to reclaim a useful individuality. Whereas it's funny because I'm usually the one harping on the cultural aspects and the team aspects of maps of meaning, right? But in this one, what I found to be the important piece to pull out was that what Peterson is saying is that the pursuit of individual interest, which means the development of true individuality, is equivalent with the identification of the hero. And as such, then that means that we have to find a way to be an individual, and not that you should do it at the expense of the good that can be obtained from a culture or a group. But if we spend, or it's so easy in today's society and culture to try to appease the masses, as it were, and it could be so small you don't even realize that you're being untrue to yourself because you're in placating mode. And what I see here is that what Peterson is saying is it's that small, those small little things can snowball into something huge if you're not constantly checking. Do an internal check. Make sure that your actions have meaning to you, that it is your truth and not just the facade that you're putting forth. And I believe that those things are the steps towards solidifying and holding on to our own individuality. I'm gonna read one little sentence here. Okay, it's two. From the book. If any of you are reading the book, this is in the chapter, The Hostile Brothers. And I just love these two sentences. It says, risk your security, face the unknown, quit lying to yourself, and do what your heart truly tells you to do. You will be better for it, and so will the world. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Marissa. Next up is going to be Andrew, Joe, and Jonathan. Andrew.
Sure, thanks. So I did watch the video clip, before the session, and also Roger, you quoted something that he said, which was something related to the story of Hydra, and he specifically something to the effect of, solving one problem just results in the creation of more problems. That's kind of the idea of the dragon, and these buggers still keep coming out, and that really struck me because I really believe in the power of words. It really it sets the stage. It influences how we think, and to me, that phrasing that way suggests that there are just it's a very negative space. It's about there's a problem and there's more problems, and that solving a problem creates more problems. Well, that's a dark place, right? I think I would propose a better way, better language would be that there are questions, right? And when you answer a question, it just raises more questions. There's a much more like affirming, not just for the purpose of being positive talk, but it's much more of a life is meaningful kind of concept. Just makes it's. I think it's so important to really dissect the words a little bit, because it just changes the whole how we think about it.
Yeah.
Roger.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think I do understand the appeal there. I understand this idea. I think it changes what's being said to a little bit, because the idea isn't that you can't. The idea is that, like, anytime you solve any problem in your life, like let's say I want to get a driver's license and I do all the work. So like now I have several problems, right? I need to pass a test. I need to get a car. It's like, right. But even once I achieve that, now because I achieved that, I have novel problems that I would have never otherwise encountered. Now, I understand the hesitation, because the idea there is that that problems are a problem, are bad. I would make the argument, the more Sisyphus argument, that problems are life, and us overcoming those is part of what gives life meaning, is our ability to be able to take on the environment, and all the threats that arise and overcome them is kind of what gives life its meaning. That's not given to us, that like it's earned through our own accomplishments, and that we own that. But I do agree with you and understand that naming it like that has a connotation of like, oh, you're just causing more problems for yourself, kind of thing. But I guess I would add that note that like it's more of the idea of problems that you have the privilege of solving. Might be a better way to put it.
Right.
Now, that's a very interesting point, and I kind of agree with Andrew about the kind of connotations. I like Boyd's way of formulating it in the OODA loop, where what you're trying to do is that you are increasing your capacity of taking action. Okay, that's what you're doing. And in the process of doing that, you're trying to form a new concept, and then you're applying it, and then you're learning from all kinds of mismatches from it to go further. But each time you are actually in one sense, you're taking apart everything and then putting it back together. But at each level, your capacity for action is growing. Because your capacity of action is growing, you're doing more things, and quote unquote, you're solving more problems. But in the process, there is a direction of growth of capacity of living capacity. So there is a positive action. Your range of action keeps increasing. So the range of things that you're doing keeps increasing. The range of, if you want to call problems or questions, they keep increasing. But at each level, you are better off. So that I think that captures both kind of these cycles. So it's like it's a spiral. So it's not just going round and round. It is going in the direction.
Yeah, the only context I would add is because we're talking about the Hydra myth. The Hydra myth in general is framing it it's framing the negative aspect of that, right? Like it's like when you cut off a Hydra's head and two more pop up, it's not normally not a good thing, right? But that's more what it's trying to refer to. But yeah, perfectly reasonable.
Thank you, Andrew and Roger. Next up is Joe, followed by Jonathan. Joe.
That last question was actually really interesting on a number of levels, actually, how any solution creates a problem, but it's a privilege to actually solve those, and that by solving them, that they create a certain amount of independent action. That actually brings a lot of things into focus as far as what Boyd's loop actually allows you to do. And one of the things that's most interesting that we even talked about the other night is the idea of pulling things apart and being able to put them back together, and that's your own. And you know, and we could use the example of the snowmobile as one of those examples with creative destruction, which is really, really interesting, but I'm not going to go into that whole thing. But I do want to talk about basically one of the ideas of the importance of courage in this entire process, and having not only an ethical system in place, but a coherent ethical system in place. Because I think sometimes when we think we're being courageous, it requires a certain amount of knowledge. And what that means is, my takeaway from this is challenging your own map in that process. And that's what courage is as far as, now, I don't know how that is taught. That's one thing. Or is it something internal that just you decide on your own? Because you talked a little bit about exposure therapy. So I guess I have a little bit of a question there. Is that what exposure therapy really does? Is it creates your ability for independent action? Let's just, ask that. So I'll just ask Roger that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Because the idea, bravery is one of the main virtues that all heroes tend to have. And the idea essentially is that the hero always voluntarily confronts something that is normally terrifying or that terrifies them. And that's essentially what you're doing in exposure therapy. The therapist is never gonna put you in like, if you're scared of spiders, the first day he's not gonna show up with a spider. He'll be like, look, okay, how bad is it? Can you say the word spider? Or right, it's like, yeah, I can say that. It's like, all right, well, can you look at a spider in a picture? It's like, well, no, I don't know about that. It's like, all right, well, could you draw a spider? Maybe. So would you be willing to draw a spider? It's like, oh, yeah, sure, I could try that. And the idea is that you find the limit, right? You find where they're at, and then you ask them, are you willing to take that? How far are you willing to push that today, right? And little by little, eventually, you start to, they make very quick improvements. Peterson notes that, like, you can actually do it pretty quickly if you're skilled at it. But what you're essentially showing them isn't that the spider or that the stimuli is scary from Peterson's perspective. What you're showing them is you're more capable than you think. You're much more than what you think you are. You're much more capable than what you think you are. Like, you are convinced that you're someone who should be afraid of spiders. It's like, and all a therapist is doing is walking you through a path to the point where at the end of it, you look back and realize, oh, no, I could have always handled this. Anyone almost all of us probably had a fear of the dark when we were children, right? Why aren't you, maybe some people still are, but why aren't you afraid of the dark anymore? Right? You had that fear. You eventually, either through some traumatic point or just by yourself, learn to be comfortable within within unknown domains where you can't see what's going on around you, right? Especially if you already have it mapped well enough to still believe that you know what's around you. But it's this idea of, like, you constantly are confronting chaos, and that is, essentially what chaos is just any place you don't know. And you're constantly pushing yourself and being brave enough to be like, I don't know if I'm capable of doing it, but I'm gonna push myself to the very edge of it and see how much I can go. And that's the idea of, like, increasing your bravery. And that's why that's what Peterson says, is like, that's the question. How courageous can you get? Well, you practice. And that's why if you practice that, you start to develop a personality that follows the hero personality. That's why it's an archetype, because it's the type of personality that starts to arise as you start imitating that behavior. And the more you do it, the closer you get to that ideal. If that makes sense.
It does. No, it makes a lot of sense. And it also maps into one of the principles that he talked about: compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not somebody else. Because the minute you do that, then you would actually stop and give up.
Right, because you're looking at other stories instead of your own, right?
Exactly. So that's the importance of that. So no, that really cleared that up nicely. Thank you, Roger. Oh, and thank you guys for the series, everyone.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Jonathan, followed by Judith. Jonathan.
Hi. So I guess out of the lecture, the thing I got most out of was this idea of actually being truthful to the voice in your head, which I found very inspiring. And he also talks about Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, how he sort of finds himself but he works his way to this conclusion through, he's sort of like in the gulag, and he sort of says, how did I wind up here? I said, I did all the right things, yet I'm here. And he says, well, Stalin did it. And he's like, well, yeah, he did, but it's sort of not really the whole story. And he starts looking around and he sees there's some people in the camp, and they're sort of just tough as nails, and they're sort of like, they're there, but they're sort of like, they're sort of like the people, the prisoners who are like not ever broken, they're imprisoned and they get killed and things, but they're never, they sort of have this defiance or this fortitude, and he admires that. He says, in this place, like these people they're sort of like the top of this, whatever this terrible game is. And he sort of starts working through this story about, well, how do these people come like this? And then he sort of starts, I guess somehow he gets to this point where like, if I sort of listen to this voice in my head, if I went back, like, would I be here, right? And I found that to be a very inspiring lesson, right? Like, he can draw that lesson there and still get fortitude out of it. And I think the most inspiring thing is that it doesn't require any mental gymnastics or great leaps. Like, you have the capacity within you. You just need to practice at it. And I thought that's a very compelling thing to try. So that was sort of like a very inspiring takeaway from this lecture.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Judith, followed by Brian. Judith.
Yeah, so I like the things, Joe was saying, Roger, and whoever just spoke now, I'm sorry. Because I think that basically, just to add another word to the whole thing that you're already talking about, is that we need to really question our belief system. So whether we're dealing with internal problems, where you're talking about exposure therapy, you're really breaking it down to like, well, why am I responding like this? Why do I feel this? To break it into small pieces. And when we're dealing with the external world, same kind of thing. There are so many embedded belief systems that we each individually have. I mean, we have them as culture, so deeply embedded, that we encounter every single day when we put food on our plates. Like, why did you put that food on the plate? Where did it come from? Or when you take a shirt out to put it on. So and we're very disconnected from some of our belief systems. So I think when we want to figure out how to live or what actions to take or what we're afraid of, if we can try to challenge in those belief systems and discover where they are and what they are, that's really helpful. And that little voice that we hear in our heads, sometimes that's telling us, well, what it's actually telling us is that this is not matching your deepest internal belief system, probably the one that you should be following. But there are a bunch of belief systems that you may have intellectually that you tell yourself that maybe are faulty, and you have to find out where you want to have those, what they are, which ones you want to abide by.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Next up is Brian Nelson. Brian.
I guess now after Judith talked, I have two things to say. I liked what she said, and also just riffing on what other people said. Maybe what Jordan Peterson is proposing is that the personal responsibility, is the mother of all ethical systems, and it trumps all the others. If whatever your belief system might be, you could lay out several of them and talk about them as Judith did, but I think he's I'm guessing now, after listening to Judith, that what Jordan Peterson is pointing at is that the belief system that overcomes nihilism, which is this succession of one belief system after another, is personal responsibility. And the other thing is, coming back to the very first question that Roger asked, what is the impetus for striking out on the quest? That was the very first question he asked. And I think that's an important one. If you look at the whole, just to again to reflect a little bit on what has been presented for the Holy Grail, there's no question, I think, that the quest is worthwhile. The quest entails going to that darkest place. So that's the, there's suffering involved there, but the yield, what's at stake, which is paradise on earth, nobody would argue that that's not worthwhile. And in some ways that's not an analogy, but it's a mythology for this exploring, your internal dark place. But be that as it may, the quest is worth, or the suffering of the quest is worth the while. Nobody argues about that. For the other one, the child, it was, I would guess, again, the quest is worth it, but it's not something that was that he set out to quest. It was something that confronted him, and he came up with the solution by himself, and really, if you will, defeated this system that was belching out all sorts of difficulties at him. And that to me is more analogous to Solzhenitsyn, where Solzhenitsyn is thrust into a situation. He didn't really seek it out. And he's reflecting on it and has discovered that if he'd assumed personal responsibility, then he could help solve the problem, not only for himself, but as it turns out, for everyone. So I think it's the Solzhenitsyn story kind of flags this and underlines this importance of personal responsibility, and why Jordan Peterson is suggesting maybe it's the ultimate ethical system to have personal responsibility, because it can overcome all of these other systems that may not be optimal.
Yeah, so real quick, I just want to jump in on this because Brian, you're right on it. For Peterson, his idea and one of his main solutions for nihilism is essentially, you want a meaningful life, give something meaning. And what giving something meaning is taking responsibility for it, right? It's like if you have a kid and you're taking responsibility for that kid, that means you care about what happens to that kid. Now now anything that happens that's related to that kid is meaningful to you because you're taking responsibility for that. It means something to you for that to actually happen. And if something bad happens, it's on you because you took responsibility for it. Something good happens, it's on you because you took responsibility for it. And his idea is like, the more responsibility you can take, the more meaningful your life. And then he's like, well, what's the extreme of that? And that's the Solzhenitsyn view of like, everything is my responsibility. Everything that's happening, everything that's playing out in this life is my responsibility. And his idea is like, well, that imbues everything with massive amounts of meaning, because it's the exact opposite of the nihilistic view that nothing matters, right? So instead of completely disassociating from your existence, you're doing the exact opposite and taking full responsibility of your entire experience. But yeah, you're right on it.
It reminds me of something that Gandhi said, which is, become the change you want to see.
Right.
Thank you, Brian. That was fantastic, and thanks, Roger. This is great. Next up is going to be Jean. Jean, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, it's great to check in. So I make to Hawaii.
Oh, you're in Hawaii?
Yes. Remember I mentioned last time I want to come here.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
Great we can, check in this year because I really missed this meeting. And I made it. I was trying to drive to the mountain, but it was cloudy, so I had to give up. The signal is bad too, so I can come back and more signals. So I think, today I just, on my trip, I realized the order and chaos, like today there's so much chaos. Like my flight was canceled on Sunday because snow in Seattle. And with all this pre-testing, all the preparation, I have to redo everything. And then, it's eventually work out. So then I want to see drive to the mountain to see the sunset and the star, and it's cloudy and raining. I drive twice, last night and tonight, and I have to drive back. It's like, in our life, there's so much chaos now. We have to like live with it, deal with it. And, there's risk, but I think to me, I thought I give myself like exposure therapy because I have to take some risks to psychological more healthy actual work because I can't stay inside too long. So I decided to take risks and come here. So it's great to check in with everyone. Thank you.
Wonderful. Jean, wonderful to see you in Hawaii. And it's wonderful to see all the palm trees and the ocean there. Thanks. All right, folks. So what I want to do now is to talk about, this has been an amazing series, and I want to do, next time we're going to talk about kind of look back upon the series at the end of our conversation. So don't miss next time. But what I want to do now is to talk about what we are starting 2 weeks from now, because as all of you know, the new book is coming out on March 2nd, and we start discussing it on March 4th. So Roger, I, Claire, and Victor, we're discussing, we have come up with a format that we are going to use because we want to make it really special. See, it's very rare to have so many people who know the subject, know the thought of Jordan Peterson so well, looking at something new that he has produced. Okay, so it's a very rare occasion. And what we do has to match that. Okay, I don't want to do another meetup on that. I want to go beyond whatever we have accomplished. So how do we do that? Okay, so this is the format that we have decided on. So what we're going to do is we're going to read a chapter. So for the first one, March 4th, we would have had just 2 days. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to look for that on March 4th, we're just going to look at the introduction, and we're going to look at the introductory video that Jordan Peterson has put out about the book. So that's all we're going to discuss. But then on, it'll be chapter by chapter. So each week we'll do a chapter. So this is how we're planning to cover it. We're going to assume that everybody has read the chapter, okay? So we're not going to provide any summary or anything like that. We're just going to assume that everybody has read it. If you're not read it, you're welcome, but then listen mostly, at least in the beginning, okay? So we're going to start by giving everybody a chance, everybody 2 minutes, to talk about the most insightful things that they have learned from the chapter. 2 minutes for just that. You're not trying to summarize the chapter. You're saying, what is the most valuable thing that you got from the chapter? Just that. And it's going to be on a voluntary basis. So anybody, and I, as always, I recommend that everybody speak. I encourage everybody to speak because you get a lot more when you speak than when you listen. Andrew was talking about the power of speech. It's very much true. And then you use the power of writing. You're going to have maybe about 20 people talk about their insights about the chapter. You would have already read the chapter. I promise you, this is an amazing set of people, as you know. Lots of new points are going to come up. Lots of deep insights are going to come up. So keep track of all of them. Organize them. Again, choose the insights. You might find, or you will most likely find, other people's insight to be more insightful than what you thought were your first take insights. So you make a list of those and you go into the breakout rooms. You will have 2 minutes in beginning of the breakout rooms to talk about your takes, your kind of super insights, or your insights after listening to all the insights. And you have a discussion about it, and then you come back. Then you get to talk about your takeaways and questions at that point. So you can put a question on the table and you can talk about your takeaways for a minute. And then for the finale, all four of us are going to put together kind of common themes that came out after these levels of insights and discussion. And we're going to have an open back and forth discussion about those, maybe about 3 big themes that came out from all the insights. And I think with that, we'll be able to do justice. That's my guess. That is based on all the meetups that I've been doing. I think this format is going to work well, but we're going to be watchful, vigilant, and we're going to keep tweaking the format to make it more and more effective. So that's the plan. So, so who is planning to join us for Beyond Order? If you're planning to join us, say yes. Okay, you're putting hands up. So let me go ahead and get the gallery view so I can see the hands. Oh, okay. All right. We got many takers here. Wonderful, wonderful. So it's going to be really, really special. And I also want to say, I'll repeat it. Unfortunately, Claire has left, but I'll talk behind her back. That's okay. She won't mind. This, what Roger, Claire, and Victor have done for this is just truly magnificent. I just love it. Roger, especially, your presentations have been fantastic. And Victor, I think you have done something spectacular as well. So it's been very good. It's been very good. So anybody, any thoughts? So let me ask Roger and Victor now. So Roger and Victor, how has it been? What has been the experience of doing this series on maps of meaning?
I keep having synchronous events where after I give a talk on a topic, a lot of things in my life start to happen where I'm like, oh, this fits perfectly with what I just gave a talk about, or like perfectly with what I'm prepping to give a talk about. And I'm sure my girlfriend's probably tired of hearing it, but I'm just constantly having this like very synchronous moments of everything kind of matching up and that weird sensation of being in the right place at the right time. So it's been a really good, fun, enlightening experience for me.
Victor, what about you? What has it been like?
I had a fantastic time, especially reading the book and watching the lectures is one thing, and coming to a community where people understand and have ideas about it and share about it. So that's been an amazing experience. And me going through the stories so many times, what happened was, as I was preparing for the story, I had this epiphanies like, oh, this is exactly what the story actually means. This is what Peterson is actually mentioning. So that happens so many times. It's just amazing. And the community itself, it's awesome to see the other person's point of view about the same point. So which is good. So
excellent. All right, folks. So we got one more. Roger, do you know what the last topic is? I think I posted it, but I don't remember now. But anyway, it's posted, folks. So so that's going to be next week, and then 2 weeks from now. So go ahead and please order your copy of Beyond Order and join us. I have placed my order for my Kindle, and looking forward to starting it. All right, folks. Bye. Have a good night.